Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Heatmap's first live event, so please
Our first live
extend
event
us your
on the
virtual
World
live
Wide Web.
event anyway.
Yes,
Yes, it
exactly,
is our first
exactly.
virtual live event, put it that way. So please extend us your grace and patience if anything gets weird, which hopefully it will not. Wow. This is already sort of exceeding my expectations for attendance, so thank you so much. I will give folks just another minute or two to keep joining, just in case there are any stragglers. Again, welcome. This is our Heatmap's first virtual live event. Today we're going to be talking about all things IRA. You know, it's been a year and a half and a lot has happened that we will get into here momentarily.
While we wait to start, Jillian, where are we all joining from today?
Oh, yeah. Well, Rob, you have the most interesting
This
answer, so why don't you start?
I'm in London. I'm here in London. It's reaching the end of the workday. Um, where else are our far-flung heat map correspondents? Where are you? I'm just trying to bring some
Oh, I'm
real.
well, I'm in Queens actually, which is exotic for heat map. Most of us are located in Brooklyn, but I'm in Jackson Heights, Queens.
And I am
Emily,
in
where are you
Brooklyn
today?
today. I'm in Brooklyn
Okay.
today.
Okay.
Two boroughs and a country.
Yeah. Fantastic. Wow, we hit 50 attendees. I think that's a good sign to kick things off. So,
Did we
for
start?
those who haven't, heard me say this already, welcome to our first ever Heatmap virtual live event. My name is Jillian Goodman. I am Heatmap's deputy editor. I'm here with founding executive editor Robinson Meyer and founding staff writer Emily Pontecorvo. And we're here today to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, passed at this point about a year and a half ago. And, you know, we've been covering this consistently for as long as Heatmap has been around, but the last month has been particularly active. Rob wrote a story last week about just the vast amount of money that has gone out the door in the form of IRA grants in the past month. And I thought that would be a good place to start. 37 billion, I think was the number, Rob, from your story.
That's right. So I think two big things are happening with the IRA right now. And I want to get into the money, but I actually want to hit one other thing because I think there's two parts of the sudden, public emergence of the IRA as a large force. The first is that the Biden administration is finalizing a lot of rules right now. These are not all directly IRA related. In fact, none of them proceed, or almost none of them proceed from the, any kind of regulatory authority that the Biden administration got under the IRA, but they are related to the IRA and they're related to this sudden public, prominence for two reasons. The first is, and to be clear here, we're talking about the light duty vehicle rules, the light duty car and truck rules. We're talking about the power plant pollution rules, which Heatmap covered last week. All these rules are able to be more ambitious because of the IRA. And second, the Biden administration is trying to get them out now and trying to get them out, roughly before today, actually, or before next week, because this is the soft deadline for finalizing rules that won't fall under the Congressional Review Act under a potential Trump administration. So, under the Congressional Review Act, Congress can repeal and kind of block future rulemaking on a topic, although the law there is a little unclear, but Congress can certainly repeal a rule if it was passed within 100 previous days of Congress being in session. It's always hard to know exactly when that's going to fall, but the kind of safe feeling is right now. So I just, to take an unplanned detour, I just wanted to start by saying that's the first big thing that is the reason we're hearing about the IRA right now. And I think the reason that suddenly the law has been so publicly prominent, and also all of those rules, the power plant rule, the clean clean vehicle, light duty truck and car rules, those are all able to be so much more ambitious because the tax credits and the subsidies and the grant programs in the IRA were able to buy down a lot of the regulatory costs of those rules. But to actually answer your question, yeah, it's been a huge month for IRA grant.
To be clear, actually answering my questions is not the most important thing that's going to happen today. So
no, but it was such a good like key that I was like, oh, we should like that's actually worth hitting before we go on. And once you did that, I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about this before. So there was two, as you were mentioning though, there's been about $37 billion of IRA grant spending in the past month. And that's a really accelerated pace compared to what we saw before. So it's a little sparse, and of course the money gets announced in different tranches, but to just give a point of comparison, that's about a quarter of the grant money in the bill. Depending on how you count, it's about a third, depending on how you categorize different programs, but let's say it's a quarter to a third. In October of last year, the Biden administration had spent less than 10% of that total money, had gotten less than 10% of the money out the door. And in just the past month, the Biden administration has gotten nearly, a third out the door. That money was in two big tranches. The first is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a $27 billion program from EPA that kind of has two components. The biggest component is a $20 billion seed funds that largely went to these three coalitions. And the coalitions are called Climate United Fund, Coalition for Green Capital, and Power Forward Communities. And they're composed of state-level green banks and nonprofits and CDFIs, or Community Development Finance Institutions, which are this Clinton-era organization, like Clinton-era designation. That's kind of like a nonprofit bank. It's a federally chartered entity. But these are meant to spin up coalitions of basically de facto green banks that will finance a ton of local decarbonization going forward. And I want to talk about it in a second, but I'll just finish running through the whole list so that then we can.
I have a question about actually green banks. I feel like we want to talk about
let's
the value of green banks, but continue, finish.
The next tranche is a $7 billion program called Solar for All that when we talk about, I want to go to my colleague Emily, and then but that the president announced at this point 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago on Earth Day. And the third tranche is this $6 billion of IRA money, another $4 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law that went to industrial decarbonization. And there were actually hundreds of programs under this big tranche of, roughly $10 billion. And they're all in the kind of, or many of them are in the tens of millions. And here we're talking about, it's like $51 million. So I believe a Kohler, if you think about the fancy shower, bathroom faucet and shower head company, Kohler has a manufacturing plant in Arizona and wants to replace their gas boiler with an electric boiler. And so they got $51 million. The same situation, replacing a natural gas boiler with climate-friendly ones at ice cream factories in Tennessee and Vermont. That's like another 20 million. It's all these kind of double-digit $1 million projects that are meant to decarbonize the industrial sector of the country. And they're going to cement and steel and concrete and chemicals refinery plant and also food and light manufacturing plants, as I was just mentioning. And those are important in the big scheme of things here because the industrial sector has historically been considered a hard to abate sector, but more importantly, it's already the country's second most carbon intensive sector of the economy, and it's on track very soon to be the most carbon intensive sector of the economy. But unlike cars or power plants, it's like all these little industrial facilities scattered all around the country, and and you have to do, depending on the chemical process that's carbon intensive, you have to like exchange out the actual hard capital asset of the factory or of the facility, piece by piece, right? It's not like you can just change what's going into the power grid. You have to actually change all these little facilities. So that was a big deal because it went to the industrial sector. So between those two programs, that was nearly $40 billion out the door from the Biden administration in the past month, combined with these rules. So to just get back to, it's been a huge month for the IRA. Now
Well,
now folks have a roadmap.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about just like the function of a green bank and what a green bank is supposed to do. And maybe actually we should go to Emily to talk a little bit more about power forward communities and like, because I feel like that's like a good functional example of like how a green bank can operate and actually be really powerful. Power forward communities is one of the coalitions that got a lot of this money, but Emily, please take it away.
Yeah, so I think like in theory, a green bank could provide low-cost loans or other types of more accessible financing to people to do any kind of clean energy project. This one coalition that got a I can't now off the top of my head, I can't think of how much money they got. It was less than they asked for. I think it was maybe 2 billion. To start this new kind of green bank program, Power Forward Communities. And they are specifically trying to create programs to finance home retrofits. So, one thing that I've reported on a lot is that the biggest kind of obstacle for people to electrify their homes is the upfront costs. It's really, really expensive to retrofit a home that already has, gas heating with heat pumps. And so this coalition is trying to figure out new ways to do that. And in their application, they had a bunch of different really interesting ideas. One was, they're going to use a lot of their funding to target specifically multifamily buildings because those are so much more, capital intensive than a single family home. And I think they think that there can just be a lot more impact in targeting those buildings. So they're going to create like energy efficiency loan programs for apartment building owners with like low cost financing. And then the other really interesting thing they're doing is that I wrote about is they're experimenting with trying to aggregate demand. So right now, like, if you're a single family homeowner and you want to retrofit your home, like that, there's obviously a lot of high upfront cost. And there's also it's just hard to like scale that because every single house is really different. The layout is different. The materials are different, like the existing heating system. And so they're trying to figure out a way to say, okay, like there's a lot of different types of homes. So maybe we can, find the similarities between certain homes and then come up with a model to decarbonize the, like, different categories of homes and then basically create like a package. I don't know if I'm explaining this super well, but basically like set packages of retrofits for different home configurations.
And maybe you don't know the answer to this actually. Would that be like within a certain community, a certain type of home within a certain community? Like what kind of scale? Because I think this is like super interesting. It does actually, and like hopefully would solve like a very present problem for a lot of homeowners.
Yeah.
Not
So
homeowners,
my understanding is they're looking at sort of the like city scale, like that, within a town or a city or a county, maybe you would do this and by basically finding a bunch of homes that would all require similar equipment, you could then aggregate those projects, buy all the equipment in bulk, contract out the labor at once, and create all of these cost savings through doing that. And so how this ties back to green banks is that I think, they're also, these are going to be like another sort of option for this low cost financing.
Well, it is funny because you think about cities, and it is one thing you do get in cities is a lot of essentially identical housing units. And they could still be single family homes, right? But like if you in DC, I'm thinking of row houses, in Brooklyn, obviously there's brownstones, but there's also the kind of more classic, I don't know what the name is, but the wrought iron, that specific kind of, I think of like deep outer borough housing. Yeah, exactly. You do get whole neighborhoods that went up at the same time in cities. I know I was thinking as you were describing this, Emily, I had an interesting conversation last week with someone who's researching why nuclear energy costs have come down. I know this is like seemingly a detour, but it relates to the power forward communities like value proposition. And in some places, nuclear has gotten less expensive to build over time. France, South Korea. In other places, like the United States, it's gotten more and more expensive to build over time. And I think when people think about things getting less expensive to build over time, they assume that it's due to manufacturing efficiencies, which is the reason that, semiconductors have gotten cheaper to make, and we've gotten better at making them. Solar cells, which are a different kind of semiconductor actually, but solar panels have gotten cheaper. That's all manufacturing efficiencies. But it seems like what actually is driving cost reductions in places that are good at building nuclear is standardization. And it seems like the key in what Power Forward Communities is doing is like standardizing, which is actually really important, because otherwise it's like finding anywhere they can standardize because
and to Emily's point, like
yeah.
so much more complicated than it sounds, especially when you get down to like the individual, status and needs of individual homes.
Yeah. Can I say something about like the structure of the green banks? Because I think there's like an important,
I think you're going to say the thing that I've been
under...
thinking of. Yeah, but go ahead.
What were you going to say?
Well, what I was going to say is that like the other really important thing about this is that it keeps that money like cycling through the economy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is something that is for people coming from this in climate world. And I'm actually a little worried this is going to get lost. Green banks and really these green coalitions, which aren't quite banks, but have bank-like components. They seem to operate as like Cthulhu-like, agglomerations of banks and nonprofits and CDFIs. If you think about a bank, like so often when we talk about decarbonization, we talk about what things will cost. And, like it's going to cost X billion dollars to protect New York City from rising sea levels. And because of that, the policy that we think of when we talk about those costs basically are grants that the government's going to write a check once for to pay for projects, right? I think the key thing to wrap your head around these three big coalitions and the kind of broader EPA project of standing up these three banks is first of all, the $20 billion that's going to these three coalitions is capitalizing the banks. It is not to be spent out, or should not be spent out. It is meant to be capital that these coalitions then lend out. And that entails a secondary thing that's really important to wrap your brain around, which is these banks or coalitions. I keep correcting my own jargon and then using the jargon I just corrected myself on. But these coalitions could be finding revenue generating projects. And that doesn't mean they're finding profitable projects. And that doesn't mean they're finding things that naturally create a tax base or create like a customer base, right? They could just be generating revenue because there's a community and the community isn't going to suffer economic costs and it's willing to pay money for that. But like in order to keep that $20 billion that capitalized GGRF cycling, they're going to have to find revenue generating projects. And that thinking about decarbonization as a process that public institutions will finance primarily by finding revenue generating projects and not by finding grants, I think is actually something that everyone involved in the climate conversation, including local officials, state and local policymakers, people who are advising these, like activists, need to wrap their head around, because that if we can find or structure these things in a revenue generating way, which again doesn't mean a profitable way, it just means a revenue generating way, and that could involve like the tax base, right? But if we can do that, then that money can stay cycling for longer. And that is having institutions that are able to finance decarbonization on an ongoing basis could be really crucial to the national path to decarbonization. But it's not something that I think mayors or county executive directors or folks in governor's offices are like thinking about right now. I think when they think about decarbonization and they think about climate mitigation, preparing for the effects of climate change, they're thinking about grants. They're thinking about getting big checks from the government to do things, spending the money, and then it's done. But this whole process will work better if they can think instead about things that they can take money to do that will then generate returns over time, and then they can return those returns to these coalitions, and the money can keep cycling.
I have a lot of different places I would like to go, but we have a question, and I don't know if everyone's found the Q&A feature yet, but feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A feature. Those show up to us. We have a question from Mike H. I think I can make that viewable to everyone. Let's try. Actually, I'll say it out loud because I don't want it to disappear for me first. The IRA's home energy rebates and Solar for All programs both have various program models to follow and learn from, including statewide third-party administration, et cetera, et cetera. How does Heatmap compare and contrast these models to measure the impacts and help states understand what works best? The scale of these programs is new, but the models available are not. And the choices states make this year and next will have long-lasting impacts on the effectiveness of initiatives across the board. First of all, very clearly stated, Mike H. Appreciate your cogence. This is like the big. This is the big question. It's like figuring out what works. Yeah.
I think we're still figuring out how to report these questions as well. I mean, I think this is like, reporting is something you kind of solve by doing, by taking lots of cracks. I don't know that we have a single in-house way of vetting these, but I think this is like a really important reporting question for us going forward. It's, I guess, how I'd answer it. Emily, how do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, one that we've been talking about, like, how are we going to know, who, how many, people get the EV tax credit? Because like the IRS doesn't really report that information. Like, are they going to tell us? Is there some other way to know? So we're still, with those kinds of questions, we're definitely still reporting it out and trying to figure out, how we're going to compare these things. I think with some of the programs, like I know we were going to talk about this a little bit later, but there are some programs in the IRA that are not even out yet. One thing that I've been kind of keeping an eye on is the home energy rebates. This is $8.8 billion going to states. None of those programs are even, only one of them has received money. Only New York State has received money. And so, I'm hoping that they will have to report back to the DOE about the, success of these programs, but I don't know if this answers your question, Mike, but I think, we're still a little early.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more, I guess, about those home rebates and other programs that have yet to like fully disperse their money. Like what can you just describe this home rebate program, I guess, in a little bit more detail, actually, Emily?
Yeah, sure. So there are two home rebates in the IRA. And it's $8.8 billion total. So there's like about 4.4 in each one. And one of them provides rebates specifically for appliances. So you can get like $8,000 for a heat pump. And that's on top of the $2,000 that you can get as a tax credit for a heat pump. And the other program is like, it's more about energy efficiency, and you get money back depending on how much energy you've saved through whatever upgrades you choose to do. So it's a little bit more flexible, kind of covers a wider range of home energy efficiency upgrades. And they can be stacked, and you can kind of like get funding for similar things from both. But there's also different eligibility for each of those tax credits in terms of what income level will qualify. And so the kind of process for these rebates is that states have to apply to the DOE for money. So far, only, so like I said a second ago, New York State is the only state to have received any money. They've only received money for the appliance rebates. And the only, they're basically going to use that money to expand an existing program that they already have in New York State called Empower Plus. And this is like a program for low-income home upgrades. And so New York had this Empower Plus program, and what I imagine they did was just like apply for a bunch of money to be able to like expand it, and they had a kind of an easy glide path because of that. Only 11 other states have applied for any money in this program. So we still have like, what does that leave? Like 48 states that have not even applied for this money.
And that's because those states are working with DOE like to comply, right? To like make their applications work? Or is that because just 11 states have like even filed.
There's like a DOE tracker, and on the tracker, only 11 states have submitted applications. And even among those, like similar to New York, most of them have only submitted applications for one of the programs, not both. And the two programs are structured really differently. So it's not like, you have to kind of, I think it's a separate application for each one. So I don't know. I think this is really interesting when we're thinking about like, when people know what the IRA is? Like, people feeling this in their daily lives. Like, this was a program that is designed to sort of hit people at home to give them access to funding for home upgrades. And it's been, a year and a half and the money's not out. So,
and it won't be up by the election.
Right.
Except maybe New York.
Maybe some of it will. I know that a bunch of other states, they submitted their applications in like December, January, and the DOE says that they are going to get money out the door, within, I think 60 to 90 days, they said. So hopefully there will be some more soon, but it's definitely slow.
Well, and this gets at something that we've talked about, we were talking about before this call, and we were talking about at our, we had an anniversary party a few weeks ago in DC with Jigar Shah, the head of the DOE's Loan Programs Office, who has done a lot of legwork. Just
he was our
like,
guest. He wasn't just
like hanging out.
We interviewed him. It was not a party with him. I feel like we
very
should be
important
clear about
clarification.
that.
Yeah,
we had a
he's
party,
like our buddy.
and at the party we interviewed him.
Yes, and a thing that he said was that, he's done a lot of legwork just to sort of explain not, the IRA and the funding that is available from the IRA, and not just the IRA, but also like the bipartisan infrastructure law and how these things work together, and I think like, it is a lot of money. I mean, and within each of these big, like, there are a lot of big blocks of money, and within each of these big blocks are a lot of smaller blocks of money, and it is just like a lot to hold in your head at one time. Like, we talk about it all day, and like, it's even a lot for us to keep track of. And so I guess, like, is that a problem for Biden? Like, is that a problem?
Right. I think there's two ways of thinking about it. First of all, yes, these programs are sprawling. And it's funny because on this call so far, we've mostly talked about the grant programs. But we're talking about the grant programs because Emily alluded to this earlier as well. But we're talking about the grant programs because that's where the street lights are. Like, we're fully looking for our wallets, our metaphorical wallets under the street lights, not because that's where we think the big economic impact of the IRA or the IIJA will be, or really the IRA. So most of the money in the IRA is in the tax credits. These are tax credits when you build a new solar farm, a new wind farm, when you buy an EV, when you manufacture an EV battery, when you mine or refine a critical mineral for an EV or for green technology, when you build a factory to do these things. All of that is covered by tax credits. And as Emily was saying, we won't get the receipts on those for years. It's a little unclear, but we won't get the receipts for years. What we do know is that pickup obviously seems to be quite strong. And we know also that companies or the federal government, the Biden administration, says that companies are using some of the new aspects of these tax credits. So for instance, under the tax credits, you can transfer the tax credits much more easily now than you could under the status quo pre-IRA. And according to the Department of Commerce or the Department of Treasury, 97% of folks using these credits have applied to make them transferable. What we don't know is like how widespread these are. We should assume, I think, that already the amount of money being spent into the economy from tax credits well exceeds the kind of $30 billion that we're talking about. However, let's just note, either way, this is a lot of money. The amount of, just we go back to the grant programs, the amount of money from the EPA Green Bank that we've been talking about, from Solar for All, from Industrial Decarb, that exceeds the total support to Israel, humanitarian conflicts around the world, and Taiwan in the most recent congressional foreign aid package that made the headlines. So we're kind of used to, in climate world, we've gotten very luxurious. We can talk about tens of billions of dollars all the time, when in fact the fight over tens of billion dollars in another context could drive national news for weeks. Just one, and potentially like affect the balance of power in major geopolitical conflicts. So I just want to like throw that out there. I think to get back to your question, like it gets at, I think, a deeper question around these laws, around the IRA, around how durable the IRA might be during a Trump administration, and also about how even to understand the IRA in the first place. The IRA was a partisan law. It passed with 100% Democratic support in the Senate, and overwhelming Democratic support in the House. It, however, could also be seen as part of a tranche of bipartisan laws that have been passed since 2020. There was the Manchin Bipartisan Energy Act in 2020, followed by, of course, all the COVID laws were bipartisan, but I think if you really want to see this as a package, it's the Manchin 2020 law, it's the IRA, it's the bipartisan infrastructure law, which of course was bipartisan, it's in the name, and it's the CHIPS Act. All of these reflect like a new, more productivist bent toward the economy from Congress.
You can say industrial policy.
Industrial policy, yeah. Well, I think it's like, I guess the question here is should Biden be running on these programs? Does he want to run on these programs? The administration seems to think that he's going to run on these programs. Does that make is how hard it is to understand and kind of wrap your head around the sheer scale of this legislation a political benefit, because it means that there's lots of little programs and they're going to survive and they're going to kind of resist any Trump era attempt to repeal the IRA as a package? Or does it mean that in fact these programs kind of go all over the economy? They have lots of different stakeholders. It's hard for voters to connect any one program to climate change or the environment, which is actually what voters say they care about. And so these are going to be very fragile programs during a future administration, especially a future administration that's like looking for revenue wherever it can get it. I think is likely to be the position of any administration in 2025 and 2026. Are they going to be very fragile because you can just you can knock down one or knock down another, and each program has its own coalition, but those coalitions will not band together in the end. They'll like try to defend their own turf and therefore be much less durable than, say, the Obamacare coalition was.
Yeah. I want to, the other nice thing about this Congressional Review Act deadline is that it gives the administration all summer to campaign on these projects, like all summer to campaign on these like tens of billions of dollars. So let's go to a question asked by, you need to scroll up, Gabriel in the Q&A. I'm going to take two first because it's sort of where we've been headed. How will a potential Trump administration approach the IRA? What IRA policies are most vulnerable to revision or repeal? And Rob, you were just, you were getting into this, but yeah, let's really get into it.
Yeah. Emily, I don't know, do you want to give some opening context here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what I understand about this is that the ones that are probably most vulnerable are like the electric vehicle tax credits and maybe the renewable energy tax credits, not just because these are the ones that Trump loves to talk about how stupid they are and how they're mandates, even though they're subsidies. But because individual tax cuts that were passed under the Trump administration are going to be expiring next year. And so Congress will have an opportunity to open up the tax code again. And when that happens, depending on the makeup of Congress, might decide to start taking a knife to some of these incentives.
And they're going to be looking for pay-fors, right? That's they're going to be, yeah. That matches what I've heard too. I don't know. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I guess the only other thing I was going to say was I do think that there is a lot. I mean, all this money that went out the door, that the 37 billion that we opened this webinar with, that cannot be clawed back. Like that is granted. As well as just like any other kind of grant funding that has gone out since the law passed.
Yeah, no, that's so true. Totally. I think my answer to that question is like exactly. I've heard. I mean, it seems like EVs, as Emily was saying, are like the big thing. I feel like I don't know, Emily, what, but I feel like hydrogen, CCS, like 45Q, the carbon removal tax credit, these things are likely to be more durable because the coalition for them involves chemical plants, fossil fuel companies, groups that have historically been closer to the Republican coalition. And if there was a Republican Congress and a potential Trump administration looking for things to kill to kind of pay for another decade of Trump tax cuts or to make the Trump tax cuts permanent, then like those things would be more likely to survive.
And I would add also probably the manufacturing tax credits as well, just because, as has been like widely reported, the places that are really benefiting from those tax credits are mostly red states in the South and throughout the country. And the governors there are going to want to hold on to those if they can.
Which is so funny because I think that I agree and have heard the same things. And I think it's like funny because Congress could wind up repealing the $7,500 EV personal vehicle tax credit, which is already kind of proving to, and probably the leasing tax credit or modifying the leasing tax credit as well, which is already proving to be this like, it's the one people hear about the most. I think what's funny is from a manufacturing perspective, from a EV deployment perspective, it's the manufacturing tax credit. It's the $60 per kilowatt a battery that you produce that's like way more salient that will actually drive a lot more EV production. And so one thing I'm curious about is if that EV tax credit, that $7,500 EV personal vehicle tax credit does get repealed, obviously it will dent uptake and it will ironically, perhaps for a Trump administration, make the EV tax code less protectionist. But it will, I'm curious how much it would actually dent manufacturing.
Sorry, yeah. we're background chatting about all of your questions.
We're back channeling about the chat. Emily, do you want to answer a question about LPO? Because I also have thoughts about LPO, but you should go first.
Well, I actually would like to. So I think we can kind of combine this. Gabriel asked first about the Loan Programs Office, how much of its lending authority has gone out the door, and are there any early successes? And also Julia asked, why hasn't the Biden administration got more money out the door by this point? Rob, you mentioned that the money that has gone out in the past month is about a quarter of the grant money available under the law. And so that means that there's still 75%, and 10% had gone down before that. So there's still, there's still more than half of it yet to go. So, let's talk about just like spending volume here and spending velocity.
Yeah, I want to be careful about that because I think there has been spending between October and now that is not accounted for in the numbers I've given.
Right. Yes.
It was slow before October. It has picked up more. I think it's going to continue picking up. And I don't want to make a claim about exactly how much has gone out the door. Partially because it's in little programs. Some of these programs, folks might, there's like several $1 billion in the law for forestry programs. That doesn't make headlines. In our work focusing on the new economy here at Heatmap, we don't especially focus on that, but that money has gone out the door and we just don't hear about it. Yeah. Did you have LPO thoughts, Emily? This is to Gabriel's question, which I feel like we both saw, but maybe we didn't read, which is, how is the Loan Programs Office, the in-house bank at Department of Energy going? Is it getting money out the door fast enough?
Yeah, well, fast enough, that's a harder question to answer. I mean, from the last that I checked, the loan programs office has gotten has granted about 25 billion in conditional loans and loan guarantees, which is about an eighth, I think, of the money that they were authorized to spend in the IRA. And I guess a couple projects that I would point out. I think like one interesting use of the loan program office funding has been this energy infrastructure reinvestment program, which basically is, programs to people, what am I trying to say? That money can be used to like repower or retrofit or basically do kind of anything to at the site of a former energy project. So that could mean restarting a nuclear plant, which we just saw this announcement recently about the Palisades plant in Michigan, or it could mean, converting a coal plant to batteries or nuclear. So I think that's been one kind of interesting use so far. I don't know if there's others that you've been tracking, Rob.
No, I mean, I think I'd note a few things about LPO. Well, first of all, it's so funny. I feel like the Biden administration has been so eager to talk up putting a nuclear plant into the site of an old coal plant. And it does make so much sense because you already have the transmission assets, the community around the coal plant's already used to living near a large scale electricity generating resource. I'm very skeptical we're ever going to see a plan like this, although I would love to be proven wrong. I just want to side note that. TerraPower. But I mean new HP one. Anyway, I a few thoughts on LPO. The first is that they are under increasing political scrutiny from Senator Barrasso and Senate Republicans on the Energy Committee. That cannot be good for their ability to spend the money quickly. It just means that every project has to get scrutinized more. They're going to be more attentive to potential setbacks, to potential risks of lending out to projects, and that's kind of bad for the whole project. And I think one can actually say that somewhat objectively, because the whole reason you have a green federal in-house bank, the thing that federal lending authorities or national lending authorities do in other countries, including China, is lend to risky projects. And so if you're under a ton of political scrutiny and you're very worried about lending out to a risky project, then you're unlikely to make the kind of long shot bets that you're supposed to be making. I know that Jigar Shah, the director, would take issue with that. But I also know that so far, LPO has on the current cycle, is looking for projects that are not going to be political risk, right? Are going to shore it up. So I just want to kind of note that LPO is under pressures that I think make the job that inherently make the job that it's trying to do very hard. There's a larger thing too that I only recently came to understand that I think is just worth a schema that I think is worth sharing with folks. It gets back to the GGRF stuff we were talking about earlier, the EPA Green Bank. The country now has two sets of green lending authorities. It seems like, based on the announcements the EPA has made, the way that the Biden administration is thinking about this is as follows. LPO exists, that's the Loan Programs Office within DOE, to finance big projects, big manufacturing projects, big transmission projects, big energy generating projects, large scale infrastructure that needs kind of a federal backstop, a long-term federal backstop that can buy down some of the cost of capital or finance things that commercial institutions wouldn't finance. At the same time, these new coalitions that have just been capitalized by the EPA are working, it seems, on the small scale work of decarbonization, finding, as Emily was saying, heat pumps, community solar, rooftop solar, electrification. They're looking for revenue generating versions of those types of projects. And I think, and they're looking, of course, for return generating versions of those projects, as we were talking about earlier. But I think that is the way to understand these new lending institutions that exist within the United States. LPO is the big, flashy, charismatic mega project funder, while these new coalitions are the are funding the kind of small yeoman's work, but still very important, the house by house work, the town by town work of decarbonization.
Well,
and
to answer
LPO is going to do some
another,
of that too, but yeah.
yeah, to answer another question in the chat, we're talking about like separate. We're not talking about like a bank that you can walk into. We're not talking about like, like a Bedford Falls savings and loan, but make it green. Like we're talking about very specific, actually, programs that were funded under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and that are, sort of operating as green banks. There are other levers that the government could pull to make, like, sort of the bank that you go to for your home loan, more, more open to financing climate activities. But, so we're basically like, there's a lot of work that's been done under the IRA, and there are a lot more levers still to pull. If,
I feel like one thing
future administrations want to. Go ahead, Rob.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just looking for a landing place.
I think one thing that is actually really important here to hit is, I didn't see the question. I assume it's like, are these going to be physical banks? Exactly what these banks will be, given that they are not physical banks. I think the way it seems like we should think about them now is like the name of financial institutions that you see on a poster outside a project. When you see an apartment getting built and it's like, this project brought to you by Eagle Bank and bank of this and bank of that. I assume that the most visible way we're going to see these institutions and is going to be through their inclusion in other places, in the kinds of places where existing projects and existing companies disclose their capital stack. Now, I would say two more things. The first is, like, it depends on what state you're in. If you're living in Connecticut, the Green Bank of Connecticut is like quite active. You may be aware of the Green Bank of Connecticut in a way that folks living in other places may not be. And these green banks are, to some degree, they have a lot of state by state variability. That actually, to get to an earlier question, would be a great reporting question that Heatmap should probably look into. But they have a lot of state by state variability. One thing we've seen is a famous project at this point, but in Montgomery County, Maryland, this is not a green project, but I think it's a good version. There's a local public authority in Montgomery County, Maryland, that has basically entered into the capital stack for local multifamily projects. And there's really just only one project that you hear about. You hear about the same project over and over, but whenever you build a new apartment building, there's a set of lenders that finance it. And in this one project, the government is one of those lenders. And what that lets the government do is buy down some of the rent, because the government doesn't need to turn a profit. It can seek lower returns from its share of the project. And that can buy down rents for folks in the project. It's a really cool idea. I think it's something we're likely to see adopted elsewhere. I'd also add, it's very bespoke. It takes a long time to spin one of these up. And one question I have about the EPA Green Coalitions more broadly is, it almost goes back to they need to find return generating projects aspects of this, which again doesn't mean profitable generating. It just means they need to find ways to cycle this money through. Are they going to create markets? Are they going to create standard ways of lending out this money? Because if they do, are they going to create even vehicles that could then be taken up not only by these publicly oriented nonprofit coalitions that were just capitalized by the EPA, but commercial banks, local banks, going forward. Because if they can find new vehicles that can finance decarbonization, that's going to be extremely powerful, and
Like the
would
charter
have
school of
like the
like
charter.
green lending. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or like power purchase agreements, right? A power purchase agreement is now a very standard thing, but it has the existence of that standard contract and that standard way of thinking about a financial arrangement has unlocked gigawatts of solar and wind across the economy. Ditto, I'd put another, like a safe. A safe is a common type of contract that people who are starting a startup sign, that just makes it a lot easier to start a company. The existence of that financial innovation has unlocked a ton of real world change. And so, Barb, it sounds a little silly to be like, the real way that these big nonprofit green banks will change the world is if they're able to come up with financial innovations that can then disperse. But to some degree, that is the work
Yeah.
of industrial policy. And a lot of what programs that progressives love to cite, the New Deal did, were actually come up with or enter into financial arrangements and create new financial institutions that change the lives of Americans and unlock things in the real economy. And so I think the big question about these green, will they find a way to do that? And will they find a way to do it in a standardized way?
Yeah. All right, y'all. It's been 51 minutes. I think we should wrap it up. Emily, do you have any closing thoughts before we go?
Oh, I guess I would just say, sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so I'm gonna
Oh,
blame,
sorry, we should have said that at
I'm
the
gonna
start.
blame
Emily's,
that
being
on
the real
my
hero here.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of money out the door, and there's still a lot of money yet to be out the door, and that's I think the main thing that we're trying to communicate here. I'll leave it at that.
Rob, what about you?
I think that's right. I mean, I think like the big question about, I think I have two big questions about this. The first is like, how much of this will the Biden administration spend down before the end of the year? I guess the second question is, will it reduce inflation in a way that voters notice? Which, by the way, is in the name of the law. And the third thing is like, should the Biden administration be running on these things? We take it for granted in climate world that these are big policies.
Yeah.
They're big policies that Democrats have fought for a long time. So of course, Democrats should be running on them. And when the IRA passed, I was like, oh, this is Biden's Obamacare. I don't know that that's the right way to think about it politically. And I don't know that that's going to really create political wins for Democrats. And it's very possible that the best policies that Democrats should run on are abortion and healthcare. And Biden should actually never talk about these policies and simply implement them quietly in the back of the room. And so I think that's my big question going forward, is that I know the president wants to appear in front of bridges and appear in front of factories and say that he has just financed and made these facilities possible, but could he?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's a question we will continue to ask in the next 6 months. And as for every question that you all have asked that we did not get to, they are thought-provoking, and we will continue to think about them and hopefully tackle them. Hopefully tackle them in the next Heatmap Live virtual event. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been perfect fun, I think. We'll see you at the next one. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.